Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are meeting here on the land of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders and to all First Peoples in this audience. Our first speaker is Greg Lehmann. Dr. Greg Lehmann is a well-known Tasmanian artist, curator, essayist, poet and commentator on history, identity and place. Descended from the Trawuli people of northeast Tasmania, Greg has an intimate relationship with the island's Indigenous culture, and his creative works explore the impact of colonisation on Tasmania's social fabric, and he has been a very important voice in this whole area of research. His research on the visual history of the Aboriginal Tasmanian has included a Master in Art History at the University of Oxford and a PhD at the University of Tasmania. He's going to be speaking to us today on the title, and it's a quote, "Prepared in the usual way, Pierre-Marie Alexandre Dumoutier's bust of Manalaguerna." Please welcome Greg Lehmann.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to speak and the very kind and generous introduction then, Alice. Also, I'd like to express my appreciation for Uncle Ray's welcome to country yesterday and acknowledge the privilege that it is to be able to speak on Gadigal land. Yesterday at the workshop, I raised a question about whether objects made by sovereign Aboriginal people at war with British colonial authorities can be called Australian objects. Today I'd like to look at another problematic object. I'd like to propose an Australian object that was not made by an Australian, was not made in Australia, has never been to Australia, and according to some should never be seen in Australia. More on that later. And just to complicate matters, I'd like to discuss this with a case study of a proxy object, an image of this problematic Australian object. Confused? Well, let's see if we can paint a clear picture of what has been at times a very bizarre story. One of John Burge's most important art historical legacies is in situating the look in the context of political otherness. Looking is a political act, a historically constructed process, such that where and when we see something will affect what we see. My research draws attention to the value of exploration in colonial art, not simply as a graphic accoutrement to written histories, but as a valuable and underappreciated source of historical understandings of the processes that shaped Australia's colonial foundations and continue to influence our attitudes and our understandings. Critical reading of the context of such artworks enable us to reveal some of the rhetorical functions that art served in the 19th century in forming attitudes to Indigenous people. My argument is that many, if not most, of these attitudes continue to exist in Australia. They continue to exist in Australia today, often in residual and contested ways, buried deep in the discursive formations of visual culture and inflecting the structures and systems that we live with every day. These are poorly recognised in Australian society, which suffers from very low levels of visual literacy, something that I think we're all in the business of trying to rectify. Critically, these discourses not only influence attitudes to Indigenous people, but also influence attitudes of Indigenous people to the coloniser and to ourselves. The result is that the art object often becomes subsumed in rhetoric that might well express our discontent with the present, but does little to elucidate the realities of the past. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why art history is so important. I'd like to take you through the experience of several years of research and curatorial practice and personal investigation relating to the representation of a sculptural work attributed to the French phrenologist Pierre Dumoutier. We will explore deeper questions of the object's creation, its probable connection with another, more famous Australian object, and see how it recently provoked an extraordinary intervention in its exclusion in a major national exhibition. I'd like to approach all of this with John Berger's idea in mind, that seeing is a political act, and Barth's proposition that the meaning of images is torn structurally by diverse and often conflicting dialectics of nature and culture. So here is the image of the object in question. It's a layered image. The lithograph was prepared in Paris by Thierry Ferré, pardon my French pronunciation, for the Atlas of de Mondeville's Voyage to the South Pole, published in 1845. It was engraved from a daguerreotype by the pioneering French photographer Louis-Auguste Bisson. The daguerreotype was taken from a sculpture created by Pierre Dumoutier. But this isn't where the layering of this object ends. Dumoutier promoted the key phrenological principles of individuality and the equal mental potential of all human beings with his novel method of casting moulage, or plaster casts, from living Indigenous subjects that he encountered in his voyage with de Ville. Further developed into busts later in Paris, these objects could be used in his cephalometer to explore differences in the cranial morphology of various oceanic populations. Dumoutier did not see such variation as innately organic, since, in his view, quote, the organisation of the brain is the same in all men. Instead, like Buffon, he considered organic differences as the indirect product of external influences, climate, what he called the social state, the mode of existence, and ancient histories of migration. Before we go any further, I'd like to spend a little bit of time looking at the subject of this image, Manalaguerna, and understanding that rather than simply an historical or remote historical subject, he was also a man with a life. Manalaguerna lived at a time when Europeans were first arriving in what they called Van Diemen's Land, the island that we called Le Truita, or Tasmania. At that time, the first European settlement had been set up at Kent's Bay on Cape Barren Island, well before the official settlement at Risdon Cove in 1803 near Hobart. And from 1797, sealers began to negotiate relationships with tribal leaders such as Manalaguerna, which often included marriage to their daughters, and this was the case with several of Manalaguerna's daughters. These women had children, and this beautiful watercolour by John Skinner Prout is of one of these women who referred to themselves as Tiralora, or island wives, with her little baby at Waibelena on Flinders Island. These little children grew up, married, colonists, and had families. This is Jane Herbst with her husband Thomas. Jane Baker, she was christened. She's the great-granddaughter of Manalaguerna. This is Mary Christine Kennedy, née Herbst, on board the MV Taruna on her way from Devonport to Melbourne in 1953, the great-great-granddaughter of Manalaguerna. And here, Patrick Lehmann with his wife Lorna and his grandfather of German extraction, Wesley Lehmann. And your presenter with my deadly ray gun ready to take on the world. I didn't understand that I was about to take on the colonial world at that time, but I was obviously ready for a fight even back then. My point here is that this is a living history. These are events. The representations are things that continue to resonate in people's lives today. They are part of our family history. This is This is a family album of snapshots that extends back into colonial history and into that powerful period of Australia's story that we have so much difficulty in engaging with. So making sense of that history, making sense of my own cultural identity, it's very much also about a search for Manalaguerna in the historical archive to understand how he existed back then and how he exists today. That search took me to the National Museum of Natural History in Paris in September 2012 to see the original bust that was produced by Dumoutier in Paris on his return, along with a number of other busts produced by Dumoutier as a result of his Tasmanian visit. And so I encountered face to face this bust, this life-sized representation, an object with a head the same size as my head. And of course I peered into his eyes looking for some sense of recognition and familiarity. Images of Manalaguerna are quite well known, some more than others. The theory engraving is little published and little known. We have other images of Manalaguerna, one here by Napier, which hangs in the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery with another version in the Savage Club in Melbourne. Very little known. And the watercolour by Thomas Bock, almost iconic in the Aboriginal community in Tasmania, amongst people with an interest in Aboriginal fire ecology because of the fire stick that he's carrying. But these images are mostly made by artists with limited skills. So they're not so evocative of a living person as the bust and the engraving. These are images that seem to reside within history rather than as a part of people's lives today. The image of the sculpted portrait, however, evokes the power of likeness, and this suggests an encounter more personal and palpable than any painting could have. So I propose this as a powerful object. And I'll talk a little bit about how that power has been exercised. The first exercise of power, of course, was through the British invasion of Tasmania. This is a story of extermination, of genocide. The stated objective of the British was to remove Aboriginal people entirely from the island. And over the space of just 3 decades, 95% of the Aboriginal population of Tasmania, thought to be around 8,000 to 10,000, was reduced to little more than 200. If I had more time, I'd talk about the Black Line. This is a map that was produced for the House of Commons to indicate the efforts that were being made in Van Diemen's Land to remove Aboriginal people from the settled districts. It involved the arming of every able-bodied man, convict, constable, soldier, free settler alike, stretched in a series of cordons across the settled districts with the objective of sweeping across the landscape, forcing Aboriginal people onto a small, narrow isthmus where they would be captured and then removed into permanent offshore detention. Some things in Australia haven't changed. The colony was so heavily invested in this exercise that they spent over half the colony's entire annual budget. Today, if this sort of thing was to occur, it would be described as ethnic cleansing. Manalaguerna was well known initially as a resistance fighter, attacking the farms of settlers. He later joined George Augustus Robinson as a translator, a guide and a diplomat in efforts to find an alternative to the Black War and seek effectively a surrender from Aboriginal people. We can see Manalaguerna this time by the Huguenot artist Benjamin Diderot lurking with great doubt in the background and being reassured by an Aboriginal man in the foreground who is actually making the agreement with Robinson that they should abandon their armed resistance and accept the government's assurances that if they were to do so, they would be cared for and looked after and eventually allowed to return to their country. A larger, the image that I just showed you before was effectively a study for a large work that Diderot executed. This is another study, or a miniature, as it was referred to, for the painting, often called the Conciliation, but referred to by Diderot as his national picture. And in this painting, we can see another important character in the story, and that is the character of Truganini. Truganini was also a resistance fighter. She narrowly escaped being hung in the first public execution in the colony of Port Phillip after she was involved in attacks on settlers and the murder of some sealers. And she also joined Robinson in this diplomatic effort to try and bring an end to the Black War. And the scene that's depicted here represents the agreement that was reached with the last armed resistance group, the Big River people, which brought an end to the Black War. Following this agreement, the survivors of the Black War, as I mentioned, were effectively incarcerated at Waibelena on Flinders Island, where they were prevented by virtue of being placed on this remote island from being able to return to their country, despite the fact that they had promises made to them. They reminded Queen Victoria of these promises in a petition in 1845, and 2 years later the Waibelena settlement was closed, and the surviving 50 or so Aboriginal men, women and children were relocated to a disused convict probation station just south of Hobart. This is an early photograph by Francis Nixon, the first Bishop of Tasmania, and in this we can see Truganini seated at far right. She seems, to my eye, to be regarding the camera with a rather confident, if not defiant, gaze. And we can see this gaze, we can recognise this gaze in a later photograph by Charles Woolley, who was the first to produce studio photographs of the Aboriginal people who were living at Oyster Cove. In this image was key in the promotion of a new identity for Truganini, and that is as the last of her people. Cartes de visite and later reproductions and postcards were often annotated with a note that she was Queen Truganini, the last of her race. Her image continued to be deployed in this manner right up until the late 70s and early 80s. Here a poster for Tom Hayden's film, The Last Tasmanian, the story of the swiftest and most destructive genocide on record. So we can see here that Truganini's image, the reproduction of this photograph by Woolley, has become intimately associated with a mythology of extinction, something that people of my age have had to live through and battle against in winning the right to be able to assert our cultural identity in Tasmania. I mentioned before that the rhetoric of these images also starts to influence Indigenous people's perception of themselves. And this is a protest poster produced by the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, first produced in 2008. Unlike Manalaguerna, Truganini left no descendants. Rather than a matriarch, a family matriarch, she is formed in contemporary Aboriginal political rhetoric as a symbol of oppression. The TAC have used this poster for over 10 years regularly in street marches where she appears as a symbol of victimhood. This poster rankles me severely because I know that Truganini was a much more complex and sophisticated character than simply a victim of colonial oppression. As well known, perhaps, as the Woolly photograph, is a bust of Truganini and her husband Warrady by Benjamin Law. These sculptural works are arguably and probably definitely the earliest and finest sculptures produced in the Australian colonies. In 2009, they went up for auction and were subject to a political campaign that led to their withdrawal from that auction. Oops. The Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre argued that the image of Truganini perpetuated the myth of extinction and denied Tasmanian Aboriginal people their continuing identity. On that basis alone, it was insulting and disrespectful to Tasmanian Aboriginal people, it was argued, for this object to be sold or even to be displayed. There was also a demand that the busts be returned to the Aboriginal community. And I went along to Tony Brown, Indigenous curator from TMAG at the time, and myself went along to a community meeting called by the TAC to discuss this at the time. And we informed the meeting that there weren't just one pair of these sculptures, but there were more than a dozen produced. And did people want to obtain the return of all of these? The answer was yes. So we asked, well, what do you want to do with these when you get them all back? Smash them, was the response. So these were powerful emotions at play. This whole issue was problematised by David Hanson, who was working at Sotheby's at the time in his Calibre prize-winning essay, and we might have a chance to discuss that more at question time. But I wanted to challenge Truganini's identity as a victim. And one of the ways that I did this was through an exhibition at the National Gallery that I co-curated with Tim Boney-Hady called The National Picture. This is how these busts are usually displayed in Australian institutions. They're displayed at eye height, presumably to maximise the opportunity for the viewer to engage with and to meet the gaze of these objects. But of course there are lots of ways that you can view these objects. And one of the, including looking down on objects. This is the pair of the Manalaguerna engraving by Thierry of the Benjamin Law bust of Truganini, and we can see that she has what is often referred to in the literature as a downcast gaze. She seems sad. She seems to be carrying the entire weight of the fate of her people on her shoulders. This is all something that proceeds from this mythology of extinction. I wanted to challenge this, to see what would happen if we changed the relationship between the viewer and the object. If instead of looking down or looking at the same level as at Truganini, we had to look up. So this is how we exhibited the busts in the National Gallery of Australia. And instead of a downcast gaze, all of a sudden, Truganini is meeting the gaze of the viewer. And this looks a lot more to me like the Truganini that we see from the photographs by Nixon and Woolley. And if we compare the two, I think you can see that it really does change the nature of seeing this object, and certainly contrasts markedly with the engraving by Theory. So the national picture was exhibited at the NGA in Canberra, the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery in Launceston, and the Tasmania Museum and Art Gallery in Hobart. Here we can see in Canberra the Theory lithographs displayed alongside of the busts. And here in Launceston, similarly, people have an opportunity to see the difference of impression and engagement that they can have with these images and objects by virtue of the angle of view. When it came to the iteration of the national picture at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, we were instructed that we couldn't include the image, the Theory engraving of Manalaguerna, because according to the Aboriginal Advisory Council, which at that time was controlled by the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, the bust had been taken from a death mask and was therefore offensive. This position was maintained despite there being no evidence. In fact, on the contrary, Manalaguerna wasn't actually in Hobart when Dumoutier visited. He had in fact died at Waibelena 5 years before, and there's no record of death masks ever been made there. I haven't got time to go into it, but my research suggests that the Dumoutier bust was created from a life mask that was more likely created by Benjamin Law in 1835. Incidentally, the TMAG also declined to display the busts at this higher viewing height. So, my conclusion is that this whole affair is an exemplar of how images and objects of politically potent historical characters in history, especially personal, traumatic and contested histories of Aboriginal people, might be prepared in the usual way by artists at the time of production, but as they travel through time, they accumulate meaning to become, as Michael Baxendale puts it, the deposits of social relationships. They are not, as Roland Barthes assures us, innocent and devoid of connotation. For my part, personally engaged as I am with this image of my ancestor, who signifies much of my own identity, I want this image to be allowed to breathe with my own aspirations for an Aboriginal identity that can be much more than a symbol of oppression, to acknowledge the complexity of the lives of these people and the agency with which they lived. I want these images to be able to flow with the growth of our own critical understanding of history and the implications of this for our own evolving identities. Just as we never encounter, according to Barthes, a literal image in a pure state in advertising, the historic image and object in the gallery is also similarly impregnated with symbolic messages or signs of connotation. In the case of Law and Dumoutier's busts and Theory's engraving, these objects fall into an energetic field of conflicting dialectics, resonating with the equally energetic violence of the colonial frontier, as much as the energy of how we frame contemporary identity today. Perhaps just as the Law busts were subject to public interrogation and their conflicting stories told, The Dumoutier bust and its engraved representation has now been exercised in the public domain by its censorship from the national picture, and perhaps this image of my ancestor can now commence a process of renovation and to move forward into a new life in the shelter of living speech. Thank you.